Today we're going to talk about a kind of interesting subject, something near and dear to my heart. Scarface actually kind of captures a lot of the background of what we're talking about, but we'll get into that in a second. First off, I want to address something. I share a lot of my videos in a lot of YouTube jazz groups. For the most part, I've been a member in a lot of those groups for years, and I'm treated with respect, and people, are free to disagree with me, and often do, but there's this Miles Davis group with thousands of members, and I posted my video the other day, and some of the comments I got, it just annoys me. They're just trolls, and you can tell some of them haven't even watched the video, and they're just hurling insults, and I just implore people, if you're not going to watch it, don't comment, don't call me an idiot and say all this stupid stuff about me. If you disagree with me, tell me why you disagree. Have the common sense to be like, oh, I don't think your points are valid and this is why. But to say, oh, this guy's a fucking idiot and all this shit that some of these guys are, there's 3 or 4 guys, just kind of, and it's a group of 5,000 to 8,000 people, maybe even bigger than that. And these people, I think half of them are jazz newbies. All the scope they have with jazz is miles. And someone dares to challenge some of that, and they get all insulted. But trolls are part of the deal. I get it. But you'd think that some of these people in these jazz groups would have a little more sophistication and debate, conversation, dialogue. That's kind of what jazz is about. And for someone to dismiss without even watching, that's fine, but why do you gotta leave insulting comments? So your buddies can kind of pile on who also haven't watched. Just don't watch it, don't comment. I feel that way about some of the thumbs down too. I get thumbs down on the videos, and I don't get a lot of them, but not once has a person said I gave this a thumbs down because of this. It's just this anonymous thumbs down. And whatever, it's part of the deal. But I don't think you make yourself look very intellectual if you disagree with somebody and you just say, you're an idiot, this is stupid. Really? Why? What was invalid about what I said to you? How am I going to learn how much of an idiot I am if you're not going to inform me and teach me where I'm wrong? You just called me an idiot and I left it at that. Well, good thing you're not president. That leads me to my next little topic I want to mention real briefly, is it feels like there's a politicizing of the virus right now, and here in America especially, there's kind of an anti-Chinese sentiment, at least from one side of the aisle, and it's so dangerous to use race, religion, ethnicity as a reason to divide people. There's economic engines behind that, and we need to always keep our eyebrows raised and our eyes open, going, what's going on here? Why are we changing the narrative to now finger pointing and and there can be responsible questions asked without it turning into a witch hunt and let's start lynching and arresting and fencing up anyone who looks Chinese. And the line between those two is very narrow. We got to be careful. I don't think that same debate is happening around the rest of the world. I still read the Toronto Globe and Mail almost every day, and shit, they comment about what's happening in America with as much amazement as any of us do, I think, at times. But that being said, there's a parallel between that type of mentality and the subject of my video today. And today we're going to talk about cannabis, herb, ganja, weed, the VIPERS, as Louis Armstrong said, and its role in jazz. And one of the first things I want to get out there is this goes for weed and it goes for heroin as well. It's not about changing your ability to play. It's allowing you to numb the pain and the fear and the anxiety of being black in this country enough to play. It's not the musical aid or deterrent that a lot of people think it is. Heroin's a painkiller, has been for millennia. Herb is something that allows you to kind of relax. And Armstrong talks about it. I'm going to quote some things here in a little bit. But first I want to delve into some of the background, some of the Scarface of all this. Pre-1900, cannabis was a pretty rare plant in the Americas. It definitely came over with the colonial powers, your Portuguese, your Spanish, your British, your French. It was used for rigging sails. It was used for all kinds of ropes on ships. It was resistant to salt water. It was used for a lot of naval and army officer uniforms. It was a very valuable textile, a very durable, resistant material. It was used in medicine for a long time. And to go back even one step further, the sativa, indica strains of the cannabis plant have their origins in the river valleys of the Himalayas. And it's out of those river valleys that the cannabis plant moves down those river valleys to the first civilizations in the Indus River Valley, the Yangtze River Valley, the Nile, the Tigris Euphrates, most Irrawaddy. Most of these great river systems housed great early civilizations in mankind's history. And cannabis, hemp, shows up in archaeological records across the world, dating back 6, 11, 15,000 years, depending on various reports. But it's clearly one of the first crops we irrigated. And irrigation is an essential part of civilization. Irrigation, it's not just cultivation that creates civilization. Irrigation is the guarantee of a food surplus, which allows the arts and architecture and upstanding civilization to start to have structure and exist. Government, judicial systems, sentencing for prisons, all these different things that require structure, organization, and some leisure time. Astronomy, mathematics, the sciences, medicine. They all require a certain amount of leisure time on our part. And leisure time hinges on irrigation, because irrigation creates that food surplus. And once we have food in the storage lockers that can get us through 18 months, 2 years, it's at that point we can start taking some of our intellectuals and some of our leaders and pushing the boundaries of what our knowledge base is. And so civilization and irrigation are very interwoven. And the fact that the archaeological record and the mainstream doesn't really recognize it like they should, in part due to Prohibition, but there's plenty of archaeological evidence that this plant was cultivated in part of all of our histories, and was used as medicine, going back to the shamans. A lot of they say the Jewish priests took baths in hemp oil. It's been part of our spiritual subconscious awakening, along with magic mushrooms. There's a whole part of our subconscious and psychological nature that these plants help us interweave with. As we get back to the more modern times, in 1900 the plant wasn't in very broad use in the Americas. We had large pockets of slavery still happening in Brazil and in the Caribbean, harvesting sugar, tobacco, all kinds of different crops. And the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish started to bring hemp crop across as an industrial cash crop, for one, because it was a great source of revenue, but two, it was a great way to placate the slaves. They were using it to pacify them and to give them a sense of happiness and a source of joy. And so the hemp crop really starts to take off across Mexico, Central America, and South America, and it's a valuable stream of revenue for these colonial powers. And it also leads to the brown and black labor force of the Central and South American land masses to start becoming more interwoven with the hemp culture as part of their community and their culture and their fabric. And as the Mexican Revolution happens around 1900, a lot of Mexicans migrate up to America, and they come into Texas and into the South, and eventually throughout the country, California. In 1900, California was a fairly small outpost on the West Coast, and so those waves of Mexican migrants changed the demographic and the population quite a lot. And California is full of Spanish architecture and the history of Latin America. It's very woven in the fabric of California and the Southwest. All of this leads to a certain amount of prejudice in white Americans against these new intruders. And that's kind of how we always have been, always will be. We suddenly have Jamaicans coming up, bringing this plant with them. Mexicans are coming across, all these different places where they wanted to escape oppression and find a new way of life. Again, the Mexican Revolution was creating a dangerous situation for families, so they were trying to find a place to escape some of that oppression, and they ended up coming here and finding a whole new form of oppression. Along with the plant, these migrants also brought the term marijuana, which is a slang term. It really should never be used to describe this plant. Moving on, the brown wave of migration, as it were, and the black as well, slave laborers who were now also starting to come across from Cuba and Dominican Republic and South America. It's amazing how many millions of Africans were brought to the New World in chains. Millions died on the way over. Millions died in the fields, and yet millions still were able to migrate north to America. And of course, we had plenty of our own slaves, but from what I've seen, some of the numbers in Brazil are even far more staggering. But they come here, they bring their families and their communities, and there's always kind of a fear of integration. Some of it's a sexual, cultural fear. Some of it's just a fear of the unknown. Some of it's a fear of the desperation that poverty creates. And that's not about what color they are. That's just about the fact that these people have less to survive with. And so robbing you might be more of an option for someone who's in dire straits. Of course, New Orleans is this great melting pot. It's a source of a destination for so many of these migrant workers from the Caribbean, South America, Mexico, even African people were migrating across. And as these people and people from all over the South were moving into New Orleans as well. So New Orleans becomes this great hodgepodge community, almost a New York before New York in a sense. There's all these different cultures intermingling. The Creole culture from the French migration. It's just an incredible melting pot, and it's a stew of humanity. And Storyville was this really poor neighborhood with a lot of brothels, and we've talked recently about how jazz and vice are very interwoven. These houses of ill repute. Jazz music was the perfect music to entice and lure people in with its sensual grooves and its soft melodies and its just entrancing feel. Sidney Bechet, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Kid Ory, Jack Teagarden, this whole movement of New Orleans music, the New Orleans Dixie Kings, they were all there. And they were creating this sound that we started to associate with sex and drug parlors, and the drugs were very much a part of Storyville. Drugs aren't only a revenue stream for the poor, which of course they are, but they're also a source of sociopathic kind of healing, of therapy, of calming my frazzled existence. And heroin does it too well. But cannabis, pot, herb, whatever you want to call it, creates a very functional but calm existence within people. And a lot of Black Americans in this age especially felt anxious when they were drinking. And you're vulnerable when you're drinking. And as a DJ in the Black community, I can tell you still to this day, a lot of brothers will come, especially middle-aged, older brothers, will come to the bar maybe have one cognac and they'll sip on it all night long. They don't want to risk making themselves vulnerable or not being able to think straight or stay on their toes. You don't want to get to the point where you're so drunk that one little comment can set you off, because that rail, when you get off it as a black man, it's a whole lot harder to get back on than it is when you're a white kid with a rich dad living out in Eden Prairie. When your dad's a white lawyer and you got money and you come from that kind of privilege, you can make fuck-ups, jump off the track, be an idiot. You can poke a cop in the chest, which I saw plenty of times. Never seen a grown black man poke a cop in the chest. It's just, sir, we're going to take my family and go. It's respectful. It's acknowledging the precarious situation I'm always in. So alcohol is not a comfort to the average black man. It's a risk-taking, anxiety-filled experience that a lot of the jazzmen avoided and chose marijuana, hemp, cannabis, whatever, over alcohol, including Armstrong. Of course, Louis Armstrong was a young orphan in Storyville in New Orleans, and he started smoking weed at a young age and fought for it and smoked it every day of his life until his passing. He was an advocate for the plant. He resisted against its banning and fought against Prohibition. He was a real ambassador for it. It kept him off the bottle. It kept him off the harder drugs. And sadly, with all of this is a racial component where giving access to these minorities to drugs and then creating with Harry Anslinger and the Drug Commission, I'm trying to think what the name of that thing was. It wasn't the DEA at that point. I wrote it down. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And that's Harry Anslinger. And they start using minorities as a way to fill prisons and to oppress these groups. And the drugs become a big part of that prejudice, part of that racism. Oh, they're bringing, if you've ever seen Reefer Madness, part of the hysteria was convincing people that these Mexicans and blacks were raping white women on this new rape drug. It's a pretty ridiculous accusation, but in those days, people bought into it. And that's why you always got to wonder what the mainstream is saying to you. They don't always tell you the whole story. Anslinger, he had connections with all the publications with William Randolph Hearst. There's a connection to the Mellon banks. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury. And so there's this whole entire conspiracy where Andrew Mellon had borrowed lots of money to Dow and DuPont. Dow and DuPont had just invented a lot of plastics and synthetic fibers. A hemp combine had been invented that was going to allow hemp to be harvested very efficiently. That was a threat to these industries, so they had a lobby against it. And using race and black and Mexican migrants as a reason to say we need to get rid of this plant, most people jumped on board. It was a commonly prescribed medicine at that point in a lot of tinctures and hemp oil treatments. And the American Medical Association didn't even recognize when they made hemp illegal under the name marijuana that that's what they had just banned. It was a real kind of fly-by-night, under the cover of dark. We're going to make this plant illegal. There's a financial windfall for us because we can now put our plastic petrochemicals across the world, which we have a monopoly on, whereas every farmer who's rural and an agrarian can grow this crop. We can't have that. We can't have a natural, renewable resource competing with our monopoly. And so it was banned for those reasons primarily, in my mind. And that symbiotic relationship of man with hemp that dates back to the beginning of cultivation and the beginning of irrigation, that symbiotic nature is why every generation that plant has come back a little bit more useful. Through natural selection, through artificial selection, it's consistently become a better medicine, a better fiber, a better fabric, a better balm, a better ointment, and the seeds filled with all these proteins and nutrients. It's a plant that's evolved with humanity. It's our symbiotic partner. It's there to do so many of the things that we need in the modern world, and it can do it better than any other plant by far, and reverse and change a lot of our global economics and our global environment situations, but that's not what the elite want. That would be a problem. Anyway, the Great Gatsby of the 20s was not the majority of America. The Roaring 20s did have an incredible time for the upper crust. 60% of the country lived in poverty, and this is before the Depression. And of that 60%, the black underprivileged were the bottom of that barrel all the time. So the appeal of maybe marketing some commercial illegal drugs was always going to be there for him. It was just the stress and the pressure of life made hemp this pacifying, enjoyable experience. And as jazz moved out of Storyville across the country, cannabis kind of follows it. And like I said, Armstrong fought for it his whole life. He called other people who smoked VIPERS. It was kind of a code word. Him and Jack Teagard and some of those guys used, a lot of guys in that era. He says it makes you feel good. It relaxes you. It makes you forget all the bad things that can happen to you as a Negro. It makes you feel wanted. And with a fellow tea smoker, you feel a special sense of kinship. And I can tell you there's a lot of validity to that. When you kind of go into a criminal activity or a secret activity with someone, it creates a bond. And so a lot of these jazz musicians were in this clique, if as it were, and this medicine calms your anxiety. And part of Ainslinger's issue with herb, he often said, was how it affected jazz musicians or musicians. Turned them into jazz people who were playing notes that weren't there and hearing space and time differently. And he was really insane about it, honestly. And Ainslinger has run-ins with Armstrong, with Monk, with Basie, with Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday. It's a long-running issue. A lot of these guys had arrests, spent time in jail, lost their licenses to play in New York. So drugs are a huge part of the oppression of the black community for still to this day. But it is pretty clear that when the upper elite wanted to oppress these new movements of people and slavery had ended, so we needed a new way to kind of keep them down, keep them under our thumb, drugs became this great new way to throw any kind of civil rights or any kind of human rights out the window. The British learned that in the Opium Wars in China. There's so many different ways you can oppress a group of people. And it creates the climate for the Scarfaces, for the great drug lords and Cuban and Central American drug czars and all the different elements of the Mexican drug war even today. Prohibition and a lot of this nonsense is wrapped up in the oppression and the populating of prisons and keeping a poor migrant group of workers down. But Ainslinger thought it really illegitimized jazz and made it not art because these guys were drug addicts. It was kind of saying, oh, these blacks, these niggers, this can't be art. They're just a bunch of drug-addled fools. And to dismiss these people and their art because of this plant that mankind's used for its entire history, it's pretty insulting to the intelligence when we think about it in today's modern world. He didn't like the way that it made the music become creative. He didn't like the way white America was jumping into the music. He didn't like the way jazz was so interwoven with all of the vice elements in this country. And there's a fear in white males especially of their wives and daughters. I've mentioned this before. There's an impotence in the conservative white male that feels threatened around any other buck in the meadow. It's intimidating, it's threatening to them, and they always want to wipe out that new challenge to their meadow. And I think a lot of racism in this country is driven by that sexual impotence, by that sexual insecurity, by that, look at the size of that guy's antlers. I can't compete with that. I'm going to have to shoot him in the back of his head when he's not looking. I sure as hell can't take him on head to head. Have my wife watch me get my ass beat. And so the fear of that sexual emasculation drives fury, it drives rage. It's a really insane part of our makeup. And the confidence and the sexual openness of the liberated black male, it just has and always will be a threat to the impotent, oppressed white male that exists in our kind of Christian, white Anglo-Saxon cultures. But there's one thing I need to see here. Jazz at its essence is rooted in improvisation, a sensual groove, and then that improvisation is about emoting and creativity, and it's also about a chemistry with my fellow players and being high together. It is a wonderful sense of communal chemistry, and I don't think it affects the playing in a negative or positive sense. Heroin also doesn't impact the playing, but it impacts the player greatly. Financially, it's a downfall for a lot of people, and the big trouble with heroin is when you obviously can't get it, and then your addiction and withdrawal kicks in, you get sick, and that creates criminals and desperation, and it can be a pretty ugly thing. But heroin addict can be pretty functional if they're on their pain med and doing their thing in their comfort zone. They can actually be pretty high functioning, highly focused people. I've lived with numerous junkies, so I have a pretty good base to say that. There was times where I couldn't tell. My roommate, in particular this one fella, I couldn't tell when he was high, but I could tell when he wasn't. It was when he wasn't wringing his hands and on the edge of desperation, that's when he was high. You know what I mean? And if he did too much, he would nod off to the music at 10 or 11 if you're in Spinal Tap. But it was when he was high that he could be functional in the back barbecuing and didn't really have a sense that there was an issue even going on. But there's some great songs in the history of jazz that discuss smoking. Ray Charles' Let's Go Get Stoned being one of them. I guess from the late 40s, early 50s. Cab Calloway does a song called Reefer Man, and Cab was renowned for being a big smoker. Benny Goodman and Jack Teagarden do Texas Tea Party, which is another code word for smoking the jazz cigarette. Barney Biggard does Sweet Mary Brown, and that's another song that's directly linked. Louis Armstrong wrote a song called Muggles. Armstrong swore by it, and there's some myth around it about him getting arrested in an airport with Richard Nixon or something I saw, but it's been debunked. I don't think it's real. But Armstrong was a real advocate for it, and from what I've seen and read, and it's hard to find a lot of pictures of black jazz musicians smoking herb, but I did find a couple. But it sounds like all of them, from Ellington to Basie to Billie Holiday to all the guys in their groups, the Benny Goodman orchestras, the Harry Carneys, all the way into the Parkers, to the Gillespies, into the hard bop era. And again, by the hard bop era, the war on drugs escalates even more in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the three strikes and the filling the prisons becomes even more of a way to suppress a population that's now becoming militant and educated and voicing its unhappiness. The drug war escalates. And let's not make any mistakes here. Black Storyville musicians and neighborhood pimps weren't bringing heroin over from Afghanistan and Thailand, Siam, as it were, back in the day. The large money behind the movement of these products, especially heroin, it comes from deep pockets. Marijuana can grow in ditches and fields, and it's a little bit more of a sustainable, locally grown resource, so it doesn't have to have quite the deep pockets and the network of just shipping something from Asia to New Orleans in 1900 wasn't the resources of the average layman. You know what I mean? You didn't have that kind of money at your disposal to bring a shipment of heroin from the Middle East, Far East. This is the machine of large economics, and it's operating to oppress and to hold down groups of people, and it really is infuriating. I have a hard time stomaching it. There's just a time for us to recognize that racism, prejudice is narrow-minded. We are human, period. We're part of one group of humanity, one culture of people. And the Harry Ainslingers and the William Randolph Hearsts, who need to oppress certain groups to protect the business interests of their friends, these are the criminals. These are the guys who are committing acts of treason. These are the liars. These jazzmen, they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to take the edge off for the day. And hats off to them. There should be no questioning it. And from, like I said, from what I said, it seems like pretty much all musicians pretty much partake in it. The herbal remedy, from Bob Marley back to Moses. Oddly enough, Mr. Bitter Sorbic Miles Davis said he didn't, in his bio, he doesn't like to smoke much. He wasn't a smoker, and judging by his personality and his interactions with people, that's not surprising to me. He's exactly the guy I know as a roommate that wouldn't smoke. He's like, nah, because he's probably the guy that gets more anxiety from it. But again, I don't think he really liked himself very much, and that's always going to be an issue. So, the interesting history of drugs and jazz in this country is a story that needs to be spoken of. And it's not here to say, oh, if you don't do heroin, you can't play like Parker. That was a media creation. That wasn't how the players felt. You learned to play like Parker, and maybe some guys did heroin to be like Charlie, but Charlie didn't play like Charlie because Charlie did heroin. You know? It's just not how it works. You know? Doing heroin's not going to make you a better painter, or a better orator, or a better book writer. It's going to make you nod off and miss inspiration when it could have hit you, or you're in the middle of a great sentence and you fell asleep. Because it's not going to be an aid in a lot of ways. And in fact, it's going to be a hindrance. It's going to keep you from practicing. You're going to be chasing that next high, chasing your dealer, trying to find the money to hawking instruments. It's very detrimental to your art form. Heroin especially. And I don't want to ever glorify the effects of heroin on jazz. We lost a lot of great young men to it. The potential for a lot of those players could have gone on for decades. And the system that they lived in put them in touch with this drug that they were going to obviously interact with, and it took out so many of them. And the attack on the black male, the breeding population of the black population, there's such an attack on that group, and it goes back, centuries. A black slave looking at a white woman could be hung, burned, castrated. It's always been there. But here we are today, and we still are dealing with prohibition. Thankfully, there's a lot of states in this country, some at different levels, some at different places of legalization, but Colorado, California, Washington, there's a lot of states making a lot of revenue, supporting their school systems. A lot of arrest numbers are going down. Intoxicating arrests aren't happening. So there's a lot of proof in the pudding. Other countries, Canada's legalized across the board. Europe's starting to take that movement as well. But again, there's a fossil fuel industry, a whole ton of textile industries, just a ton of pulp and paper industries. There's so many different aspects of the modern industrial world that would not benefit from this renewable resource being available to farmers across the planet. It has the potential to redistribute economics on a global scale, reverse urbanization, reverse a lot of the environmental degradation. It doesn't require pesticides and herbicides to grow. It's a very resistant plant. It's just, again, it's our symbiotic link. It's our partner. And there's a espionage, a type of treason that's taken this partner from us so that some asshole could sell you his synthetic alternatives that are all deadly and damaging, that are destroying environments and river systems and energy sources. The fact that biomass fuel is an alternative to fossil fuel, and the best source of biomass fuel is hemp. What hemp does per acre over corn, I can't remember the exact number, but it's 8 times to 1 the amount of fuel you get from an acre of hemp versus an acre of corn. and we have corn ethanol in a lot of our pumps now mixed in with our fossil fuel. If farmers could grow this fuel source, energy source, as well as a source of medicine and textile and paper and a food source and all these different endless potential things this plant can do because of symbiosis and evolution, it would change global economics. And that's not going to be allowed to happen. And so much of the world's agrarian population at this point are black and brown. Does the white establishment want to relinquish their power, their wealth, their greed, their military might, so that some Guatemalan farmers can have a piece of that pie? For some Colombian growers to have some wealth? Do they really want to see Africa become sustainable on its own and us not exploit their resources and steal their wealth from them? It's not what the rich and elite want to see. And the common sense of it all can only be overcome with fear. So the fear of the black, the fear of the brown, the fear of the Asian, which we're hearing today, chances are there's a whole lot of economic engines behind all those headlines. Chances are 100 years from now they're going to look back at us and say, what were these people thinking? How naive were they? They couldn't see the forest, and we can't because we're surrounded by trees. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Y'all be safe. Take care. Peace.